They boarded a ship filled with music, lights, and laughter, but what happened next has puzzled the world for decades. A love story that began with promise ended in silence, and to this day, no one knows the truth. Stay with me until the very end of this story. And if you enjoy unraveling mysteries that refuse to be forgotten, make sure to subscribe, because this is only the beginning. The summer of 1994 carried a warmth that seemed endless, the kind of golden light that makes the days stretch long and hopeful. For Michael and Sarah, both in their mid-20s, it was the season of beginnings. They had been married just 2 weeks earlier in a small church surrounded by friends and family, their smiles caught in photographs that still looked alive with joy. The cruise was their honeymoon, a 7-night journey across the Atlantic on a ship that shimmered with lights, laughter, and the promise of escape. The first days were filled with moments that felt like a dream stitched into reality. Passengers remembered the couple easily. Sarah had an open, unguarded smile that seemed to reach everyone around her, while Michael had a steady, calm way about him, like someone who always knew where he was going. They danced under chandeliers, clinked glasses of champagne on the open deck, and leaned over the railing late into the night as the sea spread out in every direction, black and endless. No one imagined those would be the last images anyone would carry of them. On the third night, they had joined a group at the ballroom where a band played soft jazz. The atmosphere was full of movement and color, sequined dresses catching the light, tuxedos brushing past tables, the sound of waves muted beneath the music. Witnesses recalled Sarah in a pale blue dress, laughing as Michael twirled her across the floor. They toasted with another young couple who were also on their honeymoon, joking about how it already felt like they'd known each other for years. Michael made a playful remark about the sea air being addictive, how he could live on the water forever. But the next morning, their cabin was silent. A steward, used to the quick chatter of guests asking about breakfast service or extra towels, knocked lightly on their door. No answer. Inside, the room looked untouched. The bed was made, their suitcases stacked neatly in the corner, clothes folded with care. 2 glasses sat on the small table, one with lipstick smudged faintly on the rim, the other only half finished. It looked like a pause in a conversation that should have continued. The crew began to search quietly, at first with the assumption that they had joined early morning activities or perhaps decided to sleep on the deck beneath the stars. But by noon, whispers were already spreading among passengers. People remembered seeing them at dinner, at the dance floor, standing by the railing with their hands intertwined. And yet, now, they were nowhere. The captain ordered a discreet investigation. Crew members checked every lounge, every hallway, even the medical bay, but no sign of them appeared. Then, as the day turned to evening, something unusual was found. On the outer deck, near the railing on the starboard side, lay 2 wedding rings, carefully placed side by side. They glistened under the fading light, catching the eyes of those who discovered them. It was as if someone had left a message without words. The rings were brought to the captain's quarters, and questions became heavier. Why would 2 people newly married abandon the very symbols of their vows? If it had been an accident, how could they have both vanished without a trace, leaving no sign of struggle, no scattered belongings, nothing but silence? Passengers whispered late into the night, some convinced it must have been a romantic gesture gone wrong, others certain something darker had happened. But no answers surfaced. The ship pressed onward through calm waters, the sound of the waves now carrying a strange weight, as though hiding secrets in their rhythm. One older passenger remembered crossing paths with Sarah just hours before she disappeared. She said Sarah looked distracted, glancing toward the horizon as though deep in thought. When asked later, the woman described her expression as both hopeful and troubled, like someone carrying a secret she wasn't ready to share. Michael, too, had been seen on the outer deck in conversation with a member of the crew, though no one could recall what was said. The crew member insisted later that it was nothing more than small talk about the weather, about how clear the night would be. But even in his retelling, there was a hesitation, a pause too long before he spoke, as though something remained unsaid. The cruise continued, though the mood shifted. Where there had been music and laughter, now there was unease. Couples held hands more tightly. Families kept closer together. Every time the waves struck against the hull, people wondered if the sea had taken two young lovers in silence. By the time the ship reached port, officials were waiting. Investigators boarded immediately, combing through the couple's cabin, examining the deck where the rings had been found, and questioning passengers one by one. The cabin remained unchanged, eerily preserved, as though the couple had stepped out for only a moment and would return any second. Their passports were untouched, wallets neatly placed in a drawer, even Sarah's favorite book resting open on the nightstand with a page marked in the middle of a chapter. The investigation revealed no signs of violence, no indication of forced entry. There were no letters left behind, no notes, no explanation. It was as though Michael and Sarah had simply walked out of their lives and disappeared into the sea without leaving even the faintest trace of themselves behind. But as days passed, fragments of strange details began to surface. One passenger swore she had heard footsteps outside her cabin late that night, hurried and uneven, as though someone was running. When she peeked through the peephole, she thought she saw the young couple moving down the hall, Sarah's hair catching the dim glow of the wall lamps. But she admitted she was half asleep and couldn't be certain. Another man claimed he saw two figures leaning over the railing around midnight, their shapes blending with the shadows. He was never sure if it was them, but he remembered hearing what he described as a soft splash in the water moments later. And then there was the crew member who found himself unable to forget the rings on the deck. He insisted that the way they were placed was too deliberate, side by side, like they had been set down with intention. But intention for what? A farewell? A symbol? Or something no one could yet understand? The official report listed the case as a disappearance at sea, unresolved and unsolved. The families of Michael and Sarah were left with questions that no one could answer. Why would they vanish without taking anything with them? Why would they abandon their wedding rings, the one thing newlyweds are least likely to part with? The sea remained silent, holding its secrets. In the years that followed, stories about the couple became almost legend among those who remembered the cruise. Some believed they had staged their disappearance, choosing to begin a new life in secret far from anyone who knew them. Others whispered that they had fallen victim to the vast unpredictability of the ocean, pulled away in the dead of night without a chance to call for help. And a few believed something else entirely, that the couple's disappearance was not an accident, not a choice, but something stranger, something that would never be explained. Even now, decades later, people who were on that ship still recall the moment when joy turned into mystery. They remember the laughter of two newlyweds echoing across the ballroom, and how quickly that laughter became an absence impossible to ignore. It was the summer of 1994, and the sea swallowed a love story whole, leaving only questions behind. But buried beneath those questions, there were details too easily overlooked. Small pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments that when pieced together might tell a story no one had wanted to believe. And for those who dare to follow the trail, the mystery does not fade with time. It deepens, waiting in the shadows of memory like the ocean itself, endless and unyielding. The ship had docked, the passengers had gone their separate ways, and yet the story of Michael and Sarah clung to everyone who had been there, like a shadow they could not shake off. For the investigators who first walked into that untouched cabin, the memory of it stayed with them far longer than they expected. There was a quiet about the room, an unsettling stillness, as if the air itself was waiting for someone to come back. Even the smallest things, the neatness of the folded clothes, the half-finished glass, the open book, felt frozen in time, mocking the fact that their owners would never return to claim them. The families had gathered in grief, their sorrow heavy with disbelief. Michael's parents were practical people, unwilling to accept anything without proof. They pressed the authorities for answers, demanding to know what had been done to search the waters, to question the crew, to check the ports. Sarah's mother, on the other hand, could not stop staring at the rings that had been found on the deck. She held them in her hand like talismans, whispering to herself that no daughter of hers would leave behind the very symbols of love she had so cherished. But there was no evidence to point in any clear direction. The sea had no witnesses. Weeks turned into months, and the case slipped into the realm of unresolved mysteries. Newspapers covered it with sensational headlines, honeymoon horror, the vanishing newlyweds, but soon even that faded as new stories filled the front pages. For those who had not been on the ship, the story became just another strange disappearance. For those who had, it became an echo in their lives, something they recalled late at night when the house was quiet, wondering if they had missed some sign, some clue that might have explained everything. But the mystery did not end there. Years later, in 1998, one of the passengers from the cruise, a man named Harold Green, claimed he had never told anyone the full truth of what he saw. He was in his 50s then, a businessman who had boarded the ship as a kind of escape from his collapsing marriage. He had kept his distance from most people on board, preferring to spend evenings alone on the deck, watching the dark water pass beneath the ship. On the night Michael and Sarah vanished, he said he had been out there again, unable to sleep, standing not far from where the rings would later be found. What he saw unsettled him even years later. He described two figures near the railing, one of them leaning too far forward, as though looking for something in the water. He couldn't be sure if it was Michael or Sarah, but he thought he heard a woman's voice, faint but urgent, saying something like "it's gone," or "we lost it." Before he could step closer, the figures moved, and then, just as he was about to call out, they seemed to vanish from his view. When pressed about why he never reported this earlier, Harold admitted he had been drinking heavily that night, and at the time he convinced himself he must have imagined it. But the memory lingered, haunting him. The detail of the woman's voice, the tone of distress, it never faded. Investigators who later reviewed his statement found it intriguing, but ultimately inconclusive. There was no evidence of what might have been lost, no object missing from the couple's belongings, no explanation for why they would lean over the railing at such a late hour. But Harold's account added another layer of mystery, one that unsettled those who heard it. Sarah's best friend, Emily, who had known her since childhood, believed the detail fit with what she knew of Sarah. She recalled a phone call just before the wedding in which Sarah had mentioned feeling like she was carrying something into the marriage that she didn't know how to explain. Emily had laughed it off at the time, assuming Sarah was just nervous. But afterward, those words took on a different weight. Theories grew like weeds. Some insisted the couple had staged their disappearance, that the neatly packed suitcases and untouched room were deliberate, an attempt to make it look like they had been taken by the sea, when in reality they had slipped away at port, beginning a new life in secret. But this theory faltered under scrutiny. Why leave behind their passports, their money, their rings? And if they had run away, why had no trace of them ever surfaced, not a single use of their bank accounts or credit cards? Others speculated that they had been overcome by the romance of the sea, that in a moment of reckless passion they had leapt together into the dark waters, leaving behind the world for their love. But even this theory rang hollow. There had been no note, no declaration, no reason for them to abandon everything they had just begun. Still others whispered about things less easy to explain. Stories began to circulate among former passengers about strange occurrences on the ship that night. Lights flickering in hallways, doors that seemed to open without anyone there, the feeling of being watched. Such stories grew more dramatic with time, impossible to separate from imagination or fear, but they added a haunting edge to the mystery, turning it into something more than just a disappearance. In 2004, a decade after the honeymoon cruise, the case resurfaced briefly when an item washed ashore on the coast of Portugal. It was a small silver locket, tarnished but still intact. Inside was a photograph of Michael and Sarah on their wedding day. The locket had never been listed among their belongings on the ship, and no one could say how it had ended up in the ocean, traveling miles before finding land. The discovery reignited interest in the case. Was the locket proof they had gone into the sea that night? Or was it planted, a cruel coincidence, or something left behind deliberately? For Sarah's mother, It was confirmation that her daughter's spirit lingered somewhere out there, that the ocean itself had become the keeper of her story. For Michael's parents, it was another blow, a reminder that answers remained just beyond their reach. Investigators tried once more to piece together the puzzle, but the locket only raised more questions. Why was it not found among their things? Who had it last? Had it been lost overboard by accident? Or had it been thrown? Theories spiraled again. Some said Sarah had lost it leaning over the railing that night, trying desperately to retrieve it before it slipped beneath the waves. Others believed it was left behind as a sign, a deliberate gesture. But what gnawed at everyone was the same question that had haunted the beginning. Why the rings? Why would they be left side by side on the deck? Symbols of devotion abandoned in silence. Was it a farewell, or was it something darker, something no one could interpret? Years stretched on, and the mystery refused to fade. For those who had known Michael and Sarah, the pain never lessened. For strangers who stumbled across their story, it became an obsession, a haunting reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly joy can dissolve into silence. What happened on that ship in the summer of 1994 remained locked away, sealed by the endless sea. But the more people dug, the more fragments surfaced, tiny pieces of a story that, when pieced together, painted a picture more disturbing and more tragic than anyone wanted to believe. And somewhere, beneath the surface of memory and rumor, the truth waited. A truth that was not murder, not accident, but something stranger still. A truth that even now feels just out of reach, like a shadow moving beneath dark water, glimpsed but never grasped. By the time 10 years had passed since the honeymoon cruise, the disappearance of Michael and Sarah had grown into something more than an unresolved case. It had become a story whispered in ports, a cautionary tale told on other cruises, a mystery that never quite loosened its grip on those who had crossed paths with it. To the families, it was still a wound that never healed. To strangers, it was a puzzle that invited endless speculation. But to the investigators who had handled it, it was a reminder of how the sea could take and conceal without ever revealing. In 2005, a small group of journalists revisited the story, publishing a series of articles on unsolved maritime vanishings. Michael and Sarah's names appeared among them, but their case stood out for its peculiar details: the untouched cabin, the carefully placed wedding rings, the locket that had washed ashore years later. The articles stirred interest again, and with it came letters, phone calls, and emails from people who claimed to know more, people who were convinced they had seen something, remembered something, or connected dots that others had missed. One letter arrived from a woman named Clara, who had worked as a junior steward on the cruise in 1994. She had never spoken publicly before, fearing that her account would be dismissed or that it might put her job at risk. In her letter, she described something strange she had witnessed on the night of the disappearance. She had been making her rounds, delivering extra blankets to a guest, when she passed the corridor leading to the couple's cabin. She swore she heard voices, not loud, but urgent, like two people speaking quickly in hushed tones. When she drew closer, the voices ceased, and the hallway was empty. Later that same night, she claimed she returned to the same corridor and found the door to their cabin slightly ajar. The room inside looked quiet, untouched. She gently pushed the door closed, assuming they had simply forgotten to latch it, but she remembered a chill running through her as she did so, as though something unseen had brushed past her. For years, she had buried the memory, but returned to her in dreams, the sound of those whispered voices echoing in her mind. Her account was added to the growing collection of fragments, small, haunting details that never seemed to fit neatly into any explanation. Then there was a man named Anthony, a musician who had been part of the jazz band playing that night in the ballroom. He recalled seeing Michael leave briefly during the music, heading toward the deck. Anthony assumed at the time that he was simply getting fresh air, but when he later heard of the disappearance, he could not shake the thought that Michael had seemed distracted even before stepping out. It was like his mind was somewhere else, he said in an interview. He was smiling, but not with his eyes. His eyes looked like they were searching for something. Details like these build a picture that was both clearer and more confusing at once. If Michael had been troubled, if Sarah had whispered of secrets to her friend, if voices had been heard in their corridor, what did it mean? Were they carrying a burden that no one else knew? Were they drawn into something far larger than themselves? Or was it all coincidence stitched together by the desperation of hindsight? The most unsettling account came from a passenger who had remained silent for years out of fear of ridicule. Her name was Marjorie, and she was in her 70s when she finally spoke of it. On the night of the disappearance, she had been restless and wandered the deck, unable to sleep. She remembered hearing music still drifting faintly from the ballroom, but what caught her attention was the sight of two figures near the railing, standing very still. She was sure they were Michael and Sarah. What unnerved her was not just their stillness, but the way they seemed to be looking out into the dark water, as though they were listening to something. Marjorie swore she saw Michael bend down and place something on the deck, though from her distance she could not tell what it was. She had assumed it was a playful gesture, maybe something romantic, but when she later heard about the rings, her memory sharpened with fear. What she saw was not casual or careless. It was deliberate, as though he were setting down a message, a mark. Her words added yet another layer to the enigma. If Michael had indeed placed the rings on the deck, then their disappearance was not an accident. It was a choice, or at least a decision shaped by something only they knew. Theories shifted again. Some suggested that Michael and Sarah had been caught up in something before their wedding, perhaps a family conflict, a debt, or a burden they could not escape. Others whispered of a pact, not of despair, but of secrecy, a vow between the two of them that whatever they carried, they would take with them into the sea, leaving behind only the symbols of their union. But none of this answered the question of the locket. When it appeared on that shore years later, investigators examined the currents, trying to estimate how long it might have been drifting, where it could have originated. The conclusions were vague at best. The ocean was too vast, its paths too unpredictable. The locket could have traveled for years before surfacing. Yet the timing, the reemergence exactly a decade later, seemed almost purposeful, as though the sea itself had chosen when to reveal it. For Sarah's mother, the locket became a kind of shrine. She kept it near her bed, touching it every morning and every night, whispering her daughter's name. To her, it was not proof of death, but of presence, a reminder that her daughter was still out there, in some way she could not explain. Michael's parents, however, withdrew further into silence. They stopped speaking of the case altogether, their grief calcified into something unspoken. For them, every new detail was not comfort but torment, a reopening of wounds that never healed. The story spread online as forums and early websites began to catalog unsolved mysteries. People who had never known Michael or Sarah debated their fate endlessly. Some spun elaborate theories of espionage, of hidden pasts, of secrets too dangerous to reveal. Others insisted it was something simpler, that love and fear had collided in the wrong moment, leaving only silence behind. And still, the sea kept its silence. What remained most haunting for those who dwelled on the story were the details that felt like signs but never aligned into a clear picture. The voices in the corridor, the distracted look in Michael's eyes, Sarah's whispered confession to her friend, the deliberate placement of the rings, the locket adrift for a decade. It was as if the story was not one of disappearance, but of a message half-written, fragments scattered like breadcrumbs that led nowhere. The cruise line eventually retired the ship, but even after it was sold, stories persisted. Crew members who had worked on it claimed the cabin where Michael and Sarah had stayed carried an odd atmosphere, one that unsettled new guests. Some said the room was colder than others, that at night strange creaks echoed from its walls, as though footsteps moved inside when no one was there. A few even reported hearing faint laughter, distant and fleeting, like echoes from another time. Skeptics dismissed such tales as imagination, the natural weight of tragedy reshaping itself into ghost stories. Yet those who had felt it insisted it was real, that the ship itself remembered what had happened that summer of 1994. Even now, those who dig into the story are left circling the same questions without resolution. Why would two people so full of life and love walk away from it all without a word? Why would they leave behind their rings, but nothing else? Why would the sea return only a locket and nothing more? The mystery remains unbroken, a story suspended between reality and legend. And somewhere within its silence lies a truth so fragile, so carefully hidden, that perhaps it was never meant to be uncovered. By the time 2 decades had passed, the disappearance of Michael and Sarah no longer belonged only to their families. It had become part of the lore of the sea, a mystery carried across forums, documentaries, and late-night radio programs where callers whispered about things that were never explained. For strangers, it was a chilling curiosity. For those who had known the couple, it was a wound that time refused to close. In 2014, on the 20th anniversary of their vanishing, a small memorial was held near the coast in their hometown. Friends, relatives, and a handful of former passengers gathered, their faces older but their memories unsoftened by the years. Photographs of the couple were placed on a table, smiling, laughing, caught in the glow of their wedding day. Candles flickered in the wind, and the sound of the tide nearby seemed to echo the silence of their absence. It was during this anniversary that another detail surfaced, one that had been quietly hidden for years. A retired investigator, long since moved on from the case, revealed that there had been a piece of evidence never released to the public. Among the couple's belongings left in the cabin was a small notebook tucked inside Sarah's suitcase. Most of it contained everyday notes, packing lists, reminders, even sketches of possible day trips at each port. But at the back of the notebook, there was a page torn unevenly, and on the opposite side a fragment of writing remained. It was only 3 words: "We can't stay." The handwriting matched Sarah's, though it was hastily written, different from her usual careful style. The page that followed had been ripped out completely, leaving behind only the jagged remains where paper had once clung to the spine. Why had this fragment been hidden? The investigator claimed it was withheld because it did not lead anywhere concrete. At the time, authorities had debated whether to release it, but feared it would invite baseless speculation and wild theories. Yet now, with 2 decades of silence behind them, the revelation stirred the mystery all over again. What did Sarah mean by "we can't stay"? Stay where? On the ship? In their lives? In their marriage? Was a note meant for Michael or for herself? And why was the next page torn out, as though it contained something too important to be left behind? Theories reignited like sparks in dry grass. Some insisted this was evidence that the couple had indeed planned their disappearance, that they had used the cruise as a chance to vanish. Others suggested it was nothing more than a fleeting thought, written in a moment of anxiety before she tore it out in regret. But the fact remained, those words existed, and they added a weight no one could ignore. Not long after the memorial, another strange account surfaced. A woman named Teresa, who had been a passenger in 1994, came forward after years of silence. She admitted she had dismissed her memory at the time, assuming it was irrelevant, but in light of the new detail, she felt compelled to speak. She remembered passing the couple in the hallway late on the night they disappeared. What struck her was not their presence, but the expression on Sarah's face. She looked like someone carrying a secret, Teresa recalled. Not the kind of secret you giggle about, but something heavier. She glanced at me, and for just a second, I thought she might speak. But she didn't. She just kept walking, her hand gripping Michael's like she was afraid of losing him. This image lingered in the minds of those who heard it. It aligned with the notebook, with the locket, with the rings on the deck. Everywhere in the story were signs of deliberation, of intention, but without context they felt like puzzle pieces scattered across the floor, impossible to piece into a whole picture. In 2017, the retired ship itself became an object of fascination. It had been sold and repurposed, stripped of much of its former grandeur. But urban explorers who managed to sneak aboard reported unsettling experiences. One group claimed they had entered the very cabin once occupied by Michael and Sarah. They described the air as colder than the rest of the ship, heavy and unmoving, as if the walls were holding onto something. When they reviewed the footage later, they swore faint sounds could be heard in the background, soft, indistinct, like whispers carried through static. Skeptics dismissed this as imagination, the mind imposing ghosts on a story already shrouded in mystery. But those who believed found it chilling confirmation that the couple's absence still lingered, woven into the fabric of the ship itself. Meanwhile, the families continued their lives in different ways. Sarah's mother still wore the tarnished locket around her neck, claiming she felt her daughter's presence strongest when she touched it. Michael's father passed away without ever speaking of the case again, while his mother lived in quiet resignation, never removing her son's photograph from the living room wall. And yet, as more years passed, it became clear that the story refused to die. Documentaries revisited it, podcasters dissected every clue, and strangers pored over the few pieces of evidence as though decoding a hidden message. Each time, the same fragments appeared: the rings, the locket, the notebook, the whispers in the corridor, the placement of the rings on the deck. Each time, the same conclusion was reached. The truth remained just out of reach, so close it could almost be touched, yet always slipping away like water through fingers. One final detail emerged in 2019, uncovered by a journalist who had been researching maritime disappearances. He tracked down the crew member who had last spoken to Michael on the deck that night. For years, the man had repeated the same story, that it was nothing more than small talk about the weather. But now, older and more burdened by memory, he admitted there was more. Michael had asked him a question, not about the weather, not about the ship, but about the sea itself. Do you think the ocean can keep secrets? The crew member admitted he had laughed awkwardly at the time, thinking it a strange remark, perhaps influenced by drink or nerves. Michael had smiled faintly, but his eyes held something the crew member would never forget, a mixture of fear and certainty. And that was the last conversation anyone recalled having with him. The weight of that question hung over everything that followed. The ocean, vast and silent, capable of swallowing entire ships and erasing every trace of them. Was it now the keeper of this mystery, hiding the truth in its endless depths? By the time 25 years had passed, the disappearance of Michael and Sarah was no longer just a case. It was a story that lived in the spaces between fact and imagination, between memory and silence. Every detail seemed purposeful, yet none of it connected. The rings on the deck, side by side. The torn page in Sarah's notebook. The whispered voices in the corridor. The locket adrift for a decade. Michael's strange question to the crew member. Taken together, they formed something almost like a message, but one written in a language no one could translate. And so the mystery endured, unbroken, unsettled. Even now, the story is told not with answers, but with echoes. Echoes of laughter from the ballroom, of footsteps in the hall, of rings catching the fading light on the deck. Echoes of two people who stepped out of sight and into silence, leaving behind only questions that no one could answer. The sea still carries their names, and their absence is a presence all its own, haunting in its incompleteness. But some say that mysteries like these are not meant to be solved. They're meant to remind us of the fragility of certainty, of how easily the ground beneath us, or the deck of a ship, can give way to the unknown. And perhaps that was the truth Michael and Sarah carried into the night. By the time 3 decades had passed since the summer of 1994, the disappearance of Michael and Sarah no longer felt like a single event. It had become a shadow stretched across time, a story retold so often that it lived as both memory and legend. For the families, the grief remained raw beneath the years, like a scar that never faded. For strangers, the mystery was a riddle without an answer, compelling precisely because it resisted explanation. The world had changed. Ships had grown larger, safer, monitored with technology that promised to keep everyone accounted for. Yet the story of the vanished newlyweds lingered, a reminder that even in an age of surveillance and certainty, there were still places where silence ruled, where two people could step into the night and never return. In 2021, on the 27th anniversary of their vanishing, a documentary crew tracked down every surviving witness they could find. They spoke with aging passengers, former crew members, investigators who had long retired, even childhood friends of Michael and Sarah. The result was a tapestry of recollections, each fragment familiar, yet when laid together, still unable to form a whole. One former passenger, now in his 80s, admitted something he had hidden all those years. He claimed he had seen Sarah standing alone on the deck earlier that night, without Michael beside her. She was holding something in her hands, something small, shining in the moonlight. He assumed it was jewelry, perhaps the locket later found in Portugal. She appeared to whisper into it before closing her hand tightly around it. When he blinked, she was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Another recalled the strange placement of the rings, describing it with a kind of reverence. They weren't dropped, he insisted. They were set down carefully side by side. That's not an accident. That's a message. But what the message meant remained forever unclear. Even now, the ocean itself seems to guard their secret. No bodies were ever recovered. No belongings surfaced besides the locket. No sign appeared in ports, in records, in the scattered traces of ordinary life. It was as if the world had folded around them, closing the gap they left behind. And yet, certain details refused to let go. The torn notebook page, the whispered voices in the corridor, the hurried footsteps, the question to the crew member about whether the ocean could keep secrets, the rings shining in the dusk. Individually, each could be dismissed as coincidence, as fragments misremembered, as imagination filling the silence. Together, they form something larger, something unshakable. They form the outline of a truth just beyond reach. For Sarah's mother, the years have not dulled her conviction. She still speaks to her daughter as though she is listening. She still clutches the locket at night. Sometimes, in the quiet, she swears she hears laughter, faint, fleeting, like the echo of joy carried back from the sea. For Michael's surviving relatives, silence became the only way forward. They no longer speak of the case, no longer seek answers. To them, the sea took what it wanted, and they cannot wrestle it back. Their grief is quieter, but no less heavy. And for the rest of us, the story remains. Passed down, retold, reimagined. A young couple who boarded a ship with their whole future ahead of them, who laughed and danced and toasted to tomorrow, and who by morning were gone. The sea is vast, indifferent, eternal. It keeps its secrets in the depths, far beyond the reach of searchlights and divers. Perhaps Michael and Sarah's fate lies there, somewhere in the silence where the waves fold endlessly over themselves. Or perhaps it lies elsewhere, in choices they made, in secrets they carried, in a truth too fragile to be spoken aloud. What remains is not an answer, but an absence filled by speculation, by memory, by fragments of detail that lead only to more questions. And maybe that is why their story endures. Because mysteries are not always meant to be solved. Some are meant to linger, to unsettle, to remind us of the thin line between certainty and the unknown. Michael once asked a question: do you think the ocean can keep secrets? 3 decades later, the answer is clear. Yes, it can, and it has. The laughter of that night still echoes faintly across the years. The music, the dancing, the toasts, they are frozen in memory, untouched, even as everything that followed dissolved into silence. The newlyweds vanished into the open sea, and the sea has kept its silence ever since.